So hopefully you have watched the video about the licensing exam and the process for that. I wanted to do a short video talking a little bit about how to study for the licensing exam. So how are the questions structured? What kind of things should we be aware of? How do we reduce anxiety? And what are the study tools that we have out there? I'll highlight some of my favorite authors and resources that we can use. So a few tips when we talk about anxiety, because it can be very anxiety inducing. A lot of times you want to pass, you need to pass, your employer's like, hey, I really need you to be licensed. And my thing is the test was expensive and I did not want to pay to take it a second time. So it can be very anxiety inducing. So a couple things that are recommended when you're looking at, the ASWB or some of the study materials is to create a study plan. What sections do you struggle in? The ASWB guidebook is great. They have details about all the different sections that questions are typically in. And so go through that and say, ooh, I'm super good with this, but I'm not great with this section. Relaxation techniques are really important and can really help you both as you're studying and when you get there. Sometimes we want to jump in and go, but you do have 4 hours to take the licensing exam. And so it's okay to take a moment to center yourself, breathe deep, get your little station organized so that you feel calm when you jump in. Any sort of study sessions you can do. So, here at King, we offer study sessions for our department, but there's also online study sessions. There are lots of programs out there that you can join or participate in, so that can be helpful. I think another thing that's really important and people talk about is keeping the exam in perspective. Yes, it's important, but it's important to also note that only about 75% of students nationally pass their LMSW test on the first try. So normally if you miss it, I think you have 90 days and then you can retake it. So it's a bummer. No one wants to have to retake a test, especially since it's expensive. However, if you don't pass, I've known lots of employers who have had workers who don't pass that are able to work with you in the interim while you're waiting to retake it. So only 75% of students pass on the first time. Now the good news is the vast majority of students who take it a second time do pass. So sometimes it's just that first time you don't pass, but then you have to do it again. And this is the same for the clinical exam as well. A number of people, I've known multiple colleagues who do not pass it the first time. So I think keeping it in perspective, studying for it and taking it seriously is important, but also if you make a mistake and you don't pass, don't beat yourself up. You just study a little bit more the next time and you take it again. There's also lots of great materials that you can use. One that I love are the materials from Dawn Apgar. She works with the ASWB to create study materials for students. And so the light green book there is a guide. It's great. It's thick. It's huge. It's got tons of details in it about different areas, things to be aware of. She also has, you can just buy a 170 question full length exam. You'll want to make sure you get the most up-to-date edition, but those are a great tool that you can use. Typically you can find those for 40 to 60 bucks used. Sometimes when newer, they're a little bit more expensive, but I found them to be a worthy investment. So you have study guides. There's some websites. They also do cost. I've heard people say good things about Agents of Change Prep and Therapist Development Center. I'm not familiar with those programs, but I've heard other people talk positively. And then there's a number of apps out there, and those are great. I used one of these for my clinical exam where I could just go through like a question a day. I could select the answer and it would tell me if it was right or wrong and why. So MSW Pocket Prep was a good one. ASWB Social Work Exam Prep is another app. So there's a lot of different ways to study. Get creative. Go out there, see what you can find. Okay, a few final things to be aware of. When we're looking at the questions, they have 3 different levels of questions. One are recall questions. So this is where you remember a concept or specific information, like terms. Application is where you use things you know to inform your actions. So it's not a quick, what is the term for this? It takes a little bit more knowledge and application to decide what you're going to do. And then reasoning. So these are often complex vignettes or scenarios where they say all these things are happening. And so you have to sort through your existing knowledge to figure out what is the first step I would take? What is the best thing to do? What is the most helpful in this scenario? And then there's 2 different types of questions. One are incomplete or direct questions. So recall questions. What is the term for this? And then the other type are vignettes. So these are actually scenarios that request a correct answer, and they often include qualifiers, which we'll talk about in a moment. The other thing to note is that while there's some level of memorization, you can't memorize all of it. So really what the exam is looking for is how do you critically analyze situations? How do you rule out answers? that kind of thing. You are not going to be able to cram enough to know every single question, and that's okay. You have to be able to apply the content that you've learned and that you know. So a couple of quick tips. One is you read the STEM. The STEM is the main body of the questions that poses the problem. And then a lot of people recommend don't jump to the answers. The answers psych us out. Sometimes you're like, boom, I already know this. And then you look at the answers and you start triple questioning it. Often, if you knew it, if it popped into your head, that's probably going to be the right answer. You've probably learned it at some point. And so they recommend don't jump to the answers. Just look. What area is this asking about? Is this a human development question, abuse and neglect question, medication, intervention question? Is it a recall question, an application or reasoning question? And you already kind of maybe know what the answer might be. You'll also want to make sure that you review the qualifiers. A lot of these questions have things like first or best or next or most. And that varies a little bit. Sometimes in a scenario, the best response is the best kind of for the overall situation. But if there's a safety issue and they're asking about the first step, I'm going to go with safety, right? That's the first thing I need to focus on. So you really want to make sure you review the qualifiers carefully. Then you assess each option. There's always one correct answer and then 2 to 3 incorrect ones. And you're never going to get questions with options like all of the above in the licensing exam. So you analyze each option, talk about why each answer is correct or incorrect. What I find is a lot of times we know which ones aren't right. And so that's okay too, to say, you know what, I don't know what it is, but I know for sure B and D are incorrect. Then you can tease out, okay, is it A or C? It's also important not to select the buzzword. So there are a lot of phrases that are very popular in social work, like strengths-based perspective or building rapport. And so sometimes our inclination as students is be like, ooh, that sounds social worky. I'm going to pick that one. But that's not always the right answer. It sounds good, but it may not actually be the best answer for that specific scenario. So you want to make sure you're really focusing on the actual answer, not, ooh, that sounds good. And then finally, if you're unsure, flag it and move on. And there's some disagreement. Some of the professionals say don't flag it. Answer the question. Don't rush through things. Focus on it, answer, and move to the next one. I'm the opposite. I found for me, there were some questions that I was so panicked at the beginning. I'm like, I don't know what the answer is. But then by the time I got to the end, I was like, oh yeah, this question is kind of similarly worded. And I knew the answer to this and it triggered what I remembered about that topic. Now I can go back to question 2 and I know the answer. So there's some disagreement about that. And you'll want to make sure that if you are taking the test that you're able to flag answers. I would hate for you to move on and then not be able to go back and answer them. So there's a little bit of disagreement about that. Finally, there are a few things to remember. One is that we need to remember the primary themes. So we have a tendency to pathologize normal reactions. We're so excited. We want to say, oh, it's clearly this diagnosis. But remember, clients have feelings and emotions. If I have a gentleman who comes in and it's a scenario and he's crying and he's struggling and he's lost his wife, I may want to jump to major depressive episode. But if he doesn't meet those criteria, the 9 criteria of hopelessness, overeating, undereating, sleep changes, etc., it may not meet criteria for that. He may just be grieving his wife, and sadness is a very normal part of that. So we want to make sure we don't pathologize what are normal human emotions in our scenarios. And remember, there's an equal focus on all 3 levels of practice. So there are questions about the micro, the macro, and the mezzo. And so you want to make sure that you're not just studying for micro or not just studying at the macro. You really want to look at all 3 levels. Social justice and macro practice is critical. And so there are sometimes questions where you think it's a micro question. It's a client experiencing maybe discrimination and issues with housing. Now, it might be a macro approach. You may just need to work with them. If the setting is you're a therapist, maybe you're working with their coping skills. But it could also be empowering them to pursue legal help. So some of the questions might seem macro, but really it's more about how do we empower our clients to take control of their own lives and their own communities and make change. The other thing that I think is really important to acknowledge is you're focusing on the process and not the setting itself. Sometimes there will be questions about settings you've never worked in. Maybe you've done your internship and your experience is in children's mental health and hospice, but you've never worked in a psychiatric hospital. There's going to maybe be a question about psych hospitals. The one thing to remember is before you get panicked and say, I don't know, I've never worked in that setting, is that really they're looking for the process. So our plan change process, right, of engagement, assessment, planning, intervention, and evaluation, that's going to apply in any setting. So even if the question is about a psych hospital, I've never worked there, I can say, you know what though? regardless of the setting, engagement is probably the first thing I need to look at. Or, oh, they're asking a question about interventions. I'm familiar with interventions in schools, maybe not in a hospital, but I think I can kind of make some assumptions based on kind of the larger idea of intervening with clients to support them. So don't get thrown off by the setting. You really want to focus on the process. The final thing to remember is that Maslow is really critical, especially with the focus on safety. So you might have questions where they talk about what is the first thing to do. Well, looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We start at physiologicals at the bottom, then safety, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. And Maslow's theory is that we couldn't work on growth, self-actualization easily if we hadn't addressed the needs at the lower levels of the pyramid. And we all know that. If you're working with a client who is sleeping in their car and doesn't know where their next meal is coming from, it may be hard for them in that moment to say, oh yeah, let's work on deep, complicated, self-esteem issues in that moment. They may be thinking, where am I going to eat next? Do I have anything for my kids? That kind of stuff. So a lot of times when you're looking at a question is if there's a safety risk, we're going to focus on that first, right? We're looking at physiological needs. Safety is also important. So there might be a question about, you have a adolescent who is in the emergency department and they have threatened to kill their teacher and they're threatening to kill themselves. What should we do first? Meeting with the family is important, sure. Maybe doing counseling about coping skills, that could be helpful. But ultimately, if the question is analyze and assess the severity of the threat against the teacher and verify the teacher is safe, I'm going to go with that, right? Because safety is going to be the most important thing. If we have a student who's made active threats to harm someone, I don't want to try to do like a family genogram, right? I really want to make sure that that child is safe, the person they're threatening is safe, right? We need to follow those processes. So when you're looking at questions, sometimes they'll say, what do you do first? And we really want to make sure that we're thinking, okay, has this client's physiological needs been met? Are the safety needs being met? Okay, now we can look at love and belonging, friendship, that kind of thing, or self-esteem or self-actualization. Okay, there are my references. I hope this was helpful for you and good luck.